if you ever want to be introduced, then you would be very lucky if you had Junko Chano introduce you. Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction. I want to welcome all of you, and I want to say it's a great honor to be invited by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation to participate in their United States-Japan Opinion Leaders Exchange Program. And my very special thanks to Executive Director Junko Chano, whose leadership has enhanced and added luster and strength to the foundation. And we've seen that in Washington. I also appreciate the arrangements that have been made for me during my week here by Aya Murata. She has very skillfully smoothed the path. And I also want to thank her able assistant, Risa Arai. She's been great every step of the way. I note also when I arrived that you have a very distinguished minister who is here, a member of the House of Representatives in Japan, Yuriko Koike, and I just wanted to acknowledge that she's here and thank her very much for coming. Maybe she should stand so she could be recognized. There she is, great, good. Well, my dear friends, I have another friend from OECD who is here also, and I thank him very much for finding the time to come. Knowing of Prime Minister Abe's 3 arrows, one of them is womenomics, and that, as was mentioned, 28 years of my professional life has included United States womenomics, I chose to take you on a personal and political journey, my personal and political journey, through minefields and milestones as a woman in heels. Now let me start off with a question. How many of you have credit cards in your own name? Raise your hand. Credit card in your own name. All right, great, good. Thank you. But if you lived in the United States in 1972, as a female, you would have to have a male sign for you to ascertain that you would have the responsibility for using the credit card. And it wasn't until the early 1970s, with passage of the Equal Credit Act, was it illegal to so discriminate against women in credit. So how could they establish credit to start a business, to gain housing, to do anything that they wanted independently if they were single? And after graduating from college, the job choices were, for a woman, housewife, secretary, a rural, maybe elementary school teacher, or maybe a nurse. But forget being a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, an executive, a school principal, let alone a college president. And as a matter of fact, looking for a job in publications, there was a section of newspapers and magazines, want ads for women, and a separate section for men. So what a division that was. And some companies required the woman to sign a pledge that she would not have a child during her employment. And therefore, that didn't really change until the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, which prohibited discrimination of workers based on pregnancy or childbirth. We had to wait until 1993 to have the Family and Medical Leave Act. The Family and Medical Leave Act simply said that for 12 weeks, you could leave your job for childbirth, for a special illness, but without pay, 178 other countries offer some kind of paid leave. As a matter of fact, I understand that Japan has a parental leave policy which is better than the United States in that parental leave can be taken for up to a year until the child reaches 1 year at 50% of salary. In the United States, I do want you to know that legislation has been introduced to provide for some paid leave through an insurance plan. So I hope that something will happen to advance that legislation. So when did I come tripping in heels? I was a professor at a community college, and I found out later that I made a bit less than my colleagues, but I didn't realize it at the time, with the same rank. And in 1970, before many of you were even around, a 51-word amendment was offered in the Congress of the United States. It was introduced by Congresswoman Martha Griffiths. She was a Democrat from Michigan. It was called the Equal Rights Act. Interestingly enough, she got it out on the floor of the House of Representatives to be voted on by something called a discharge petition. A discharge petition was very difficult to get because you had to get signatures from the members of Congress to have that bill come out on the floor without going through the committee, So it was an affront to the committee chair. However, the committee chair at that time was a man named Emanuel Seller from New York, and he, in Judiciary Committee, he was not about to let an Equal Rights Act get out of his committee. So she succeeded, and it was actually signed by President Nixon in 1972. Now, as you know, for an amendment to make it to the Constitution, it needs to have 38 out of the 50 states pass it. And so then the crusade or the effort was to get those 38 states to approve it in their state legislatures. So the struggle began. Now that motivated the establishment of commissions for women in various parts of the country. There were quite a few of them, to look at the Equal Rights Amendment and to try to get their states to approve it. That was sort of my epiphany. The women's movement, I say, put the movement into me. I was appointed to serve on the first Commission for Women in my county, and that was in 1972. And at that time, it made me very aware of the gender inequities that I saw about me in employment, in education, in credit, in housing. So I worked for my state's passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and for affirmative action in education and employment for equal access to opportunities. It was also the year that something called Title IX of the Education Amendments was signed into law. Now, Title IX may not mean anything to you, but this was the provision that was against discrimination and enhanced the role of women in sports. It was signed into law, and it guaranteed opportunities to women, especially in sports, as I mentioned, and we know the difference that that has made. In the first Winter Olympic Games in 1924, women could compete in only one sport. Guess what that was? Figure skating. And why? Because they felt that other sports were considered too dangerous for women. And now in the Sochi Olympics, women competed in 14 of the 15 sports. And I'll bet you're going to find the same numbers when Tokyo hosts the 2020 Olympics. Well, taking you back to 1972, there was a woman named Helen Reddy, a songwriter, and she wrote a song that became very popular at the time. It was called, "I Am a Woman, Hear Me Roar." And that's when Gloria Steinem started Ms. Magazine. Now, Gloria Steinem had a statement, too, that she said, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Now, that resonated at the time. I don't believe it. You don't believe it. But at that time, it worked. So Ms. Magazine got started, and Maryland passed the Equal Rights Amendment. But looking ahead nationally, It got 35 states to approve it, but not the requisite 38 states. It's still not in our Constitution, but it still continues to be reintroduced. So there is still an Equal Rights Amendment Act in Congress now. Continuing her story, I recognized that I could help advance the chances and the issues that I believed in if I had a place at the table, which meant an elective office. And so that's what got me started. With the blessing of my family, I began my campaign for the Maryland legislature, the Maryland General Assembly, House of Delegates. We have two major political parties, as you know, in the United States, and I was registered as a Republican in a district with a 2-to-1 Democratic versus Republican registration. Now, as you know, people can cross over and vote for people of another party. So what I did is I got out voter rolls and with supporters wore out literally 3 pairs of shoes, not heels, 3 pairs of shoes, knocking on doors. Knocking on doors to meet the people so they could see face to face somebody who wanted to represent them in their state legislature. My children had a chant. Their chant was, "Elect our mother and get her off the streets." And however, I think it helped. But there are some things that one can't control in terms of timing. The year was 1974, and that was the time when President Ford pardoned President Nixon in something that was called the Watergate scandal. I guess history books will show it, but most of you probably don't remember that. And I remember some people asking me if I believed in the double standards. As double standard, and I said, well, no, of course not. I thought they meant gender, but they didn't. They really were referring to the fact that President Ford did pardon President Nixon. Well, I lost the election that year. I lost my first election. I was the closest loser, but closeness only counts in horseshoes, maybe in something else. So, but I lost. Actually, all Republicans took a beating in the polls that year, and you could see even congressionally the same thing happen. But this is an important point, and that's why I bring it out. I decided to run again, even if the election was 4 years away. And I think that's important. Why? Statistics show that most women who do run for office and lose for an office don't run again. They lose their confidence. They think they can't do it. And I would like to say that I think it's very important. And quite frankly, it's never stopped the men. Even President Clinton, President Obama, President Lincoln, they have all lost elections, but they didn't give up. And it's made a great difference. It's actually an opportunity to learn, to make connections. So I went back to knocking on doors. And I sometimes got the question, are you running as a woman? And I thought, well, how do I answer that? Do I say, no, I am running as a man? Well, this time I topped the ticket. And I was elected to the Maryland General Assembly House of Delegates, and that year was 1978. Backtracking, in 1976, there was a vacancy in Congress that was filled by a Maryland state senator. It left that state senator's seat open, and the determination about the replacement was going to be made by the Republican Central Committee. I applied for it. I'd had some political experience. I'd been a professor, raising a family, and there were 3 other candidates. And during the questioning, I was asked, do you think, Mrs. Morella, that with your family, that you would be able to handle the responsibilities of office? Yes, we had been raising 9 children, 3 biological, and 6 that were the children of my late sister who died of cancer. I was a professor at the college, had political experience. Hearing that question, I knew I would not be appointed, and I was correct. But had my husband been the candidate, they would have said, "Oh, Mr. Morella, we applaud you for raising such a nice, large family, and we know that you will understand the responsibilities of the state legislature." Onward. As a newly elected Maryland legislator, the first meeting I arranged was with the Republican delegation chairperson who was going to make the committee assignments. In support of my request for a seat on the powerful Appropriations Committee, I reminded him of my victory in a district where I was in a minority party, and luckily, I was appointed to that committee and the subcommittee on law enforcement and transportation. I remember driving to Annapolis, the state capital of Maryland, for a special committee of my appropriations subcommittee, and I was stopped on Route 50 on the highway to Annapolis by a police officer. I immediately apologized. I gave him my license and I apologized and said, "If I was speeding, officer, I didn't mean it. There were no cars on the road." And he never said a word, took my license, went to the back of my car where I had my license plate which said, "Maryland House of Delegates, District 16, which was my district. He then returned and he handed me the ticket, but I looked at it and it was a warning. And I said, "Oh, thank you, officer. If I was speeding, I won't do it again." And then he finally spoke. And he said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it for your husband, the delegate." That really happened. Well, I have a personal theory, and that is, if you're patient enough, time wounds, all heals. Think about it. Time wounds, all heals. And sure enough, I went to my subcommittee meeting, and the superintendent of the state police was testifying before that subcommittee for his budget. So it was a great opportunity to talk to him about, the erroneous assumption and stereotyping done by some of his officers, and that I hope that it would indeed be corrected and our subcommittee would take note. So I think in the long run, it really did help. Well, in the Maryland legislature, the women's legislators became a very important group for unity, discussion, advocacy of issues. We made a difference, indeed, in the passage of legislation dealing with child support, child custody, child care, safety laws such as seat belts, safety seats, motorcycle helmets, victims' rights, drinking and driving laws. Not only that, but we got to know each other. And my personal feeling is that when you know people, respect people, listen to people, you can learn from people, and you can lead. Well, going on, after serving 8 years in the state legislature, I was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1986. I was predicted to lose because of the lopsided party registration, and an opponent who was a state senator and a nice guy and a millionaire. Well, knocking on doors, people connecting with people, along with newspaper endorsements, which I received, obviously helped because I won. A television moderator said, "Oh, that Morella, she knows her district. She will go to the opening of an envelope." Think about it. Get an opening of an envelope, and indeed, I think I did open a lot of envelopes. Politics is about people and earning the trust of the people that you want to represent. Intertwined is another one of my adages, and that is, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And that's really true when you think about it for all of us. And at that time, there were 24 women in the House of Representatives, 11 Republicans, 13 Democrats. Now there are 79, 19 Republicans, and 60 Democrats. 18%, and a woman who was Speaker, who is now Minority Leader. And in the Senate at that time, there were two women, one who was newly elected from Maryland, Barbara Mikulski, and the other who was Nancy Kassebaum Baker, whose husband, Howard Baker, became the U.S. ambassador to Japan, and she was here with him. Now there are 20 women in the Senate, 4 Republicans, 16 Democrats. That's 20%. So the total is 18.5%. We are not proud of being listed globally at 79%. But then, as I understand it, the Japanese diet consists of 10.8% women, 8% in the lower house, and 16.1% in the upper house. So unfortunately, Japan ranks 124th globally. Well, again, the Women's Caucus was a source of support, strength, and camaraderie. We may have disagreed on some issues, so we worked together and partnered on those where we did agree. For instance, on issues like pro-choice, pro-life, you're dealing with, we didn't handle that because there were differences, but there were plenty of other issues where we could come together as a force. I wanted to point out several successes that I think the Women's Caucus particularly contributed to. One of them is the Violence Against Women Act. The issue of family violence for a long time had been that dirty little secret hidden under the rug. Well, we pulled out the rug and we showed the ravages to families and society of such violence. We wanted to show that it's a crime and create strategies and solutions to prevent and protect. So, you know, obviously we didn't have enough women in the caucus to pass anything. So we worked with our male colleagues, showing them the support from groups in their constituencies. Groups that non-governmental organizations were very helpful, and women's groups. And we eventually recruited the business community, the medical community, and public safety community. Lifetime TV was helpful, as was Liz Claiborne, and Avon, American Express, insurance companies, and many male colleagues joined in sponsorship. The landmark legislation included elements like training, hotline, shelters, and the bill was signed into law in 1994 to be reauthorized every 5 years. I was the prime sponsor of the reauthorization in the year 2000, and that's when we added human trafficking to the Violence Against Women Act. And those provisions have been maintained and made a difference. It was reauthorized in 2005, and finally, last year it was reauthorized. Each reauthorization has included some new elements, such as immigrant women, date rape. And since 1994, when the Violence Against Women Act was enacted with bipartisan support, no other law has done more to combat domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking in our communities. It's proven effective in reducing the rates of domestic violence by more than 50%, creating safer communities for women, men, and children. Domestic violence programs across the country provide services to about 70,000 victims. They answer about 23,000 hotline calls, and they educate about 26,000 professionals and community members in prevention and education programs. There is continued hope for eventual passage of another piece of legislation that's been introduced, an International Violence Against Women Act. Well, another example of bipartisan support and I think a bipartisan minority of women making a difference, one of which I'm very proud, is the establishment of the Office of Research on Women's Health at the National Institutes of Health, which I was honored to represent during my time in Congress. It's a premier national medical research facility in the United States. A report was issued on the status of women at the institutes, and it pointed out that women were not included in clinical trials or protocols. In other words, they were being treated like little men. And you know, anatomically, we're not men. We are different. So working together in a bipartisan, bicameral way, Senators Mikulski and Snowe, a Democrat and a Republican, and on the House side, Congresswoman Schroeder and myself, Democrat and a Republican, confronted the Institute's director and the Institute's directors, too, and introduced legislation establishing such an office on women's health. It was enacted. It has been very effective. It has made a difference in our understanding and diagnosis and treatment of women from heart disease, autoimmune diseases, lupus, HIV, AIDS, all of the hormonal differences. And no longer do they just use male rats for their experiments. Well, what is the takeaway? The need, the strategy, the support, coalitions, and perseverance has made a difference. As a matter of fact, next week on March 3rd, I'm going to participate in a national summit on women's health in Boston, Massachusetts. And the concept is looking back, but looking ahead with far more that needs to be done. Well, folks, the need for women in science and engineering led to a commission that I sponsored, which included experts in the fields that offered critical recommendations, which led to partnerships in STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, math, to encourage, recruit, and retain women in the sciences. We still have that need. I remember when Bill Nye, the science guy, you don't know who he was, but he was a man who was, he's still around, very popular because he motivated young people in schools to get involved with science. I was on the science committee and he appeared before the committee. And I said, well, you know, Mr. Nye, you have done a great job motivating young people, but you know, don't you think we could really use a Kate Sale, the technology gal? And he said, you know, you're absolutely right. And that's what we were trying to do. I could list other achievements helping women in construction. Yes, literally construction, apprenticeships, mentoring. But I submit again the importance of working together, respecting others, listening, learning, and leading. Now, in Congress, along with the milestones that I've mentioned, there have been many minefields, too. To mention a few, the government shutdown in 1975 that was continued into 1976 because of the weather. That impacted particularly my constituency, since I represented many federal employees who were told they weren't essential and therefore could not serve our country. As a matter of fact, I predicted that before our last government shutdown, I was asked, well, Mrs. Morella, do you think there will be a shutdown? I said, no. They'll kick the can down the road, but they won't shut government down. Now you see how right I was. But then when I looked at these statistics, there were only 39 Republicans who had been in Congress during the previous shutdown. So there was not really that element of experience to know what the impact could be. Well, that was one of the millstones. The impeachment of President Clinton was another one. I was one of like 5 Republicans to vote against the impeachment. The reason I gave the statement I made on the floor of the House was, it is perjurious, which meant the president had lied. It is perjurious, but it does not imperil the nation, so let us move on. And indeed, we finally did. Of course, the Iraq War, that was another one where I was one of just a handful of Republicans to vote against it. My rationale for that was I felt we should not do it alone, that we should make sure that we had the United Nations force with us before we encountered it. But that's now all past. There were other issues. Whenever you're in any particular responsibility situation, you're going to have a number of controversies that will be emotional, divisive issues that are going to appear where you'll have to make decisions. And I represented perhaps the most competitive district in the country. So obviously I reached across the aisle, tried to forge compromises. And in some instances, constituents would call my children and tell them how their mother should vote. Or sometimes they would complain, and information technology was with us through emails, blogs, and mass mailings. But my friends, it wasn't like it is today. There was no tweeting at that time, no Facebook at that time, but plenty of emails and phone calls. At one point, once in a while, when one of my staff would say, there's a nasty letter that came in, Congresswoman, we don't know how to answer it. And I would say, well, write down the phone number and just put it on the corner of my desk in a box. And then occasionally, if I was voting late in Congress, I would pick up that letter and I would dial the number. And inevitably, I would get this response. I would say, this is Connie Morella calling, Mr. Jones. I get nothing, no answer at all. No answer at all. And I'd say, this is Connie Morella, and I'm in my office, and I just wanted you to know I read your letter. And then inevitably, with just slight variations, it would be, I didn't mean what I wrote, or I didn't think you'd read it. And then we'd have a little conversation, and afterwards he'd say, thank you for calling. Well, I would then find out that he talked to all his friends, and he said, the Congresswoman actually personally called me. Never about what the issue was, never about whether we disagreed on the issue, but it points out people to people can't be beat. When you acknowledge other people, then you're going to get a favorable response from that. Okay. I could see the seeds of a house divided toward the end of my 8th term, the steady drumbeat of the march to the right. Indeed, since that time, Congress has become polarized, and unfortunately, little is being accomplished. Polls show that only about 9% of Americans approve of the job that Congress is doing. Well, what happened to bring about that change? I'll give you some of the issues. Redistricting, every 10 years, according to our Constitution, we check on the numbers of people, whether they're legal or illegal. And then we look at our congressional districts and make decisions about whether there are the numbers that are comparable in every district. That is in the hands of the politicians who are elected in that area, in that state. And so therefore, when they do it, they're going to think about their party in terms of creating districts that are going to help their particular party. That has created what we call safe districts. So if you have a safe district, in other words, it's a Democratic district, they call them blue. Republican district, they call them red. then all you have to do is get your primary voters to vote for you, and you will be elected in the final general election. And not many people vote in primaries. They all say, I vote all the time. But did you vote in that primary? I was busy, but I always vote in November. Well, the primary date, whether it's May or June, becomes the new November. So if it's a safe district, then they don't have to worry about reaching over to the other side to pull things together. I'd also have to raise something that I'm not proud of in the United States, and that is the amount of money that has gone into elections. And we had a Supreme Court decision that exacerbated that, the Citizens United, which said that corporations were like people, and it allowed entities to pour money into, anonymously pour money into political campaigns. Also, party dictates. Political parties can tend to get too severe, and they have a litmus test. You know, you vote this way, or else you may not get a committee assignment or something else. And I think the fact that members don't even know each other, when they're so busy raising money or in their districts, and are divided by party, they don't have a chance to know the families of their colleagues or to know something about their colleagues. And when that happens, it's easy to be divisive. It's easy to be against them or to speak against them. So I think that they need to know, they need to have bipartisan briefings that are mandated, and I think they have to get to know each other and maybe have a schedule that is Monday through Friday for 3 weeks, and then 1 week back in the district. I feel that it is important that that we who are electing people make sure that our policies are being listened to by the people we elect. And I wanted to point out, too, that I think women seem to understand a little more than the men, at least according to practice, what the word compromise means, and that compromise is necessary. We saw that in the Senate, even our U.S. Senate, that it was the women who finally said, we've got to come to grips with doing something about the post-government shutdown and the debt limit. And I think it's perhaps, I don't know whether we're born with it or whether it's something that happens through society, but I do think that they need to teach the importance of the word compromise. I love the institution. I love Congress. I'm grateful to have been able to serve. I think of the work of our foremothers, those who were there early. I'm going to mention a few of them to you in history. Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin was the first woman elected to the House of Representatives, and you know, from Montana. She was elected before women had the right to vote, except in her state. In a few other states, women could vote. Jeanette Rankin, she is, women got the right to vote in 1920, and it was 1917 when she was elected. Actually, she goes down in history as the only person to have voted against 2 world wars. She voted against the First World War, and then she ran for the Senate, and she lost running for the Senate. She later on ran for Congress again, and it was during the time of the Second World War, and she voted against the Second World War too. So it's kind of unique. I think of battling Mary Norton. This was a woman who served from 1925 to 51. She said, "I'm no lady, I'm a member of Congress." I don't know what that means, but yes. And she, another woman, Rebecca Felton. Rebecca Felton was the first woman in the Senate in 1925, age 87 years, and she served 1 day. She was appointed to serve, and she said, I am going to serve that day to show that a woman can be a member of Congress. So she served 1 day. Edith North Rogers set the record for being the longest-serving woman in the House. She served for 35 years. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to serve. And her slogan was, unbought and unbossed. Do you understand? Unbought, no one can buy me, and no one can boss me. And that was pretty much the slogan that she used. The list of leaders goes on to even one who died not very long ago, toward the end of 2013, Lindy Boggs. Lindy Boggs had been appointed to replace her husband, who had been Speaker of the House and was in an airplane accident. She served beautifully. She later became our ambassador to the Vatican. We didn't have a room for women. We had to go down several flights to find a restroom even, whereas the men had one right outside the chamber. But there was a room, and so we got it dedicated to women. It was called the Congresswomen's Room. It had nice sofa, bath arrangements, and a few other little side rooms too. We dedicated the room to her, to Lindy Boggs. Well, at the dedication, she made some comments, and in her comments, first of all, I must tell you, John Quincy Adams, his father had served as president, John Adams. John Quincy Adams served as president, and then John Quincy Adams later served as a member of Congress. So it was interesting. After he was president, he became a member of the House of Representatives. Well, the chamber was right outside that what then became the Congresswoman's Room. And he had some palpitations of the heart. And they brought him into that room where he died. He died on a sofa in that Congresswoman's Room. So the Congresswoman's Room has a statue of John Quincy Adams. And under it, it says, here in this room, in this area, from John Quincy Adams. So when Lindy Boggs spoke at the dedication of the room in her name, she said, well, here we are, she said, and I want to point out that John Quincy Adams, who died in this room, his father would not listen to his mother, Abigail, because Abigail had written to her husband, to John Adams, and said, remember the ladies. If you don't, they will foment such a revolution as will not be undone. And so she said, John Quincy Adams, she said, your father did not listen to your mother, but here you are surrounded by strong women. And I thought that was a great comment for her to make. And then just one sad note about a member of Congress, and that was a woman named Koya Knutson. You may never have heard about her. Koya Knutson from Minnesota. She was running for her third term in the House of Representatives. And this was in 1958. And her husband wrote a letter, I think he was inspired by her opponent, wrote a letter where he said, due to wifely neglect, my family life has deteriorated to the point where it is almost non-existent. My family life has deteriorated to the moment that it is almost non-existent. That letter was printed in the Fargo, North Dakota, Fargo newspaper, but it was picked up by the national press, so it made all the newspapers throughout the country pretty much, and it was called the Koya Come Home Letter. Koya Come Home Letter. You can Google this. And she lost the election, even though her party won across the board. She lost. She ran again. She lost. She ran another time, and she lost. Then she divorced her husband, of course. They found out he was an alcoholic. But it was interesting because she died, I think, about 20 years ago or 15. I remember there was an editorial in the Washington Post where they had interviewed her during her life, obviously. They had interviewed her, And they found out that she had been a victim of domestic violence. And so the editor said, well, why didn't you bring this out? Why didn't you let people know about this? This might have had an effect. And she said, because that kind of violence you don't talk about. She said, that's a family matter. I say that because that represents how people looked at it at that time. But hopefully not anymore. At any rate, now we're very pleased that women are the largest. We've made some advances. More need to be done. But now we know that we have women who are the largest small business owners, executives of major companies, presidents of colleges and universities. For instance, the president of Harvard University is a woman. The president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is a woman, and you could name a lot of others too. There are Supreme Court justices, physicians, researchers, achievers in almost all professions. I also, incidentally, met just earlier today with a group called JWIN, Japan Women's Innovative Network, that are promoting diversity in the workplace. Met with some young, dynamic women who are in high positions in some of our major companies, and I thought that was a great start. We need to continue to work together on that. So, but we still have a way to go. So let's work together, encourage and mentor. As a matter of fact, I think I want to talk to you about something else before that. Encourage and mentor other women. I want to point out that women earn more bachelor advanced degrees than men, but they still trail in business, science, and technology. As an example, for the first time, female economics doctoral candidates at Duke University will outnumber men. There'll be 2/3 of them women. And there's still a pay gender gap. Women in the United States receive about 77% of full-time male workers. In Japan, they receive 70% of male workers' salary. But you know, I found it interesting and sad to note that the pay gap in Japan widens as much as 40% for those over the age of 40. That's pretty startling. And this figure comes from an OECD report, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I was honored to serve. Women in financial services make up 54% of industry's labor force, 16% of senior executives, 19% of board directors. But there is a critical need for female CEOs in Fortune 500 finance companies. A recent study by a tax and audit firm found female hedge fund managers outperformed in the Standard & Poor's 500 stock index. And, you know, reports have been made of how women, as executives in finance institutions, very few of them are, have made a difference in their portfolios. And so I would question maybe if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, the crash might not have been as severe. But really, what I really mean to say is we need a balance. We need a balance. I mean, and I think that's pretty evident. We've seen some breakthroughs. I'd like to point out in the United States, we've seen some breakthroughs. Janet Yellen, she's the head of our Federal Reserve. And 4.6% of the Fortune 500 CEO positions are held by women. Actually, also 4% of the Fortune 1000 CEO positions, also same percentage, are held by women. But now, you know, we're proud of the fact that General Motors is headed by a woman, Mary Barra. Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Lockheed Martin, Yahoo, Facebook, to cite a few. There's a whole list. But women still face the challenge of culture, tradition, and work-life balance. It's a little less in the United States, but certainly in Japan. there is the powerful message that the primary care of children rests with the mother. I note that Prime Minister Abe has vowed to eliminate waiting lists for child care and provide training for mothers returning to work. And as a matter of fact, the number of key positions, I think he said 30% by 2020 would be an increase, and I think that would be great. He's talked about raising the consumer tax, consumption tax, in order to help to fund, not all of it, but to help to fund this increase of child care facilities and training. The female workforce is 60%, and if it were raised to 80%, like men, 8 million, it would raise the GDP by 14%. So I think we need to look at the financial benefits and the benefits to society to utilize these women that we are training, higher education doing so well, to bring them into society and let them use their expertise to enhance and elevate our society. I note that 2% of Prime Minister Abe's 19 cabinet members are female, and that women make up 15% of department managers across all sectors. So more can be done, and I know that he knows that. We also see this as being important because of the aging population and because of the declining birth rate. So all of these factors come together to say, hey, let's use that 52% of people that we have to full advantage. A recent United Nations study shows that if women were given the same access to productive resources as men, it would reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. Similarly, the United States Agency for International Development stated that women are more likely than men to reinvest in their families' food, security, health, and education. And I always have felt that when a woman is elevated in any way, all women are elevated, and society is richer for it. So, my friends, let's work together, encourage, mentor other women, take chances, and remember our sisters throughout the world who don't have advantages that we have. And as you know, I serve as president of the United States Association of Former Members of Congress. Our international programs are directed by a woman, the very able Sabina Schleich, who's here. And I'm proud of our very vibrant Congressional Study Group on Japan. It has 2 House co-chairs. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican, and they are both women, Diana DeGette, Shelley